Good evening all. I'm Jim, I'm a facilitator, which means that I get to ask questions and to keep the meeting nice and productive, facing in the right direction. So that's me, Jim McLaughlin.
Barney Kringle, I work for a company called Hatch Regeneris.
If you'd like to point to the next person who needs to, there we go, you can go that way if you want to.
I'm Phil Nichols, I work for the Trust, I'm the Associate Director for Insights, Impact and Fundraising.
I'm Mark Lockhart, I am a Joint Chief Executive of Westway Trust.
Cynthia Dyes, I live on Swanwick Estate in Golden Road.
I'm Marie Mullen, I work for the Trust and I work on community engagement and environment.
I'm Julian Tomlin, I'm a resident artist of area this area of life, and I'm at the Howard Club.
I'm Jenny Marshall and I work for Open.
I'm Alex Russell, I'm Joint Chief Exec of Westway Trust.
I'm Matt Bradley, I am Director of Communications and Marketing for Westway Trust.
I'm Emmanuel from News Princess Emmanuel, Artistic Director and Founding Director of Community Arts and Performing Arts and Education, bringing back social change news DIC, and I'm a local resident from when I was a child, so in North Kensington.
Brilliant.
I'm Jason, with Community Engagement and Communications at Westway Trust.
Colleague on sound is?
Oh, I'm also on Trust.
Hello. And Dawn, Gary, Westway Trust. And hello, very, very welcome. How are you doing? We're just doing a quick round of introductions, names and...
Yeah, I'm Floyd and I'm fashionably late. I'm with Just Solutions 123 and Trees for Growing Well. So mainly finding out about what's happening, so more of an observer today, I think.
Great. So as you will see, we are being recorded for the record. Just it's very difficult to remember what's said between our meetings, so there's going to be a transcription of that. It also helps with writing up the minutes and for doing action plans and so forth. The focus of this evening's meeting is going to be on two subjects. We're going to have Barney, who's going to explain to us about the economic development project and research that's been going on, and also a talk from ISIS, who's going to talk to us about participatory methods and that are going to be used for grant making. But first, shall we just have a recap on the action minutes from the last meeting? Where's Marie? Marie?
So we had a meeting, we had two public forums in February, so we noted the actions. We're just going to go through and give an update. Some of them are ongoing, but some of them we have some progress with. So one of the discussions and commitments was a review of the Trust's membership and constitution, which will, and governance structure. Do you want to give an update on that?
Yeah, so the board has actually appointed a lead member on this, and I'm working with her to develop some examples of governance structures and membership structures. What we've agreed is, sorry, and actually it's the second action point as well, which is to look at grassroots models of governance. So we've done some research and used some guidance and help from the Charity Commission, that's been published by the Charity Commission. We've created a board paper. We're going back again to the next board meeting to discuss in further detail membership models, and from that we will be looking at governance models and agreeing a process where we can go back out with the community and discuss those models. What we have agreed is that working on the constitution, the formal written document, has to come at the end of the process so that we can look at membership structures, discuss those with the community, get some feedback, and then we will create the written constitutional document for consideration by the members in due course. As a slight frustration on that, we had in our mind that we would like to present that at the Trust's next AGM, which will be November, December this year. I think we have to recognise that if we're going to do a thorough process and have deep community involvement in developing that, that might not be possible, and we'd rather do it right and have more community involvement in building the model. than an early delivery. I certainly wouldn't want to be waiting for the AGM the year after, but that's the process we're going through. So the board is actively engaged in looking at this, and that's the process before we go back into public community consultation.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay, so the next action point of discussion is around elevation. So we talked about the impact on staff and tenants and the trust buildings. So our action was to discuss it at our next health and safety meeting. So we have quarterly internal health and safety meetings. We haven't had one since the last meeting, but it is on the agenda for the next meeting. And while we're on environment, I'm just going to give you a little update on the soil contamination report that came out last week. Some of our members will know this, but in October, when the first reports in the media that this research was being undertaken and that some of the results were a little bit worrying, we kind of committed to do some independent testing. So we had soil samples taken from 6 sites, 24 samples at the end of January. So we are awaiting the results, and we've committed to have them kind of like independently verified and to share them with the local community. The report that came out last Thursday, 2 of the 6 sites that were tested were on Westway Trust land, and we weren't aware that they had been taken there. Both of those sites came back fine for the things like dioxins and PAH that were reported in the media, but obviously it's very concerning to people who live locally and some of our tenants and members. So we'll be kind of updating you as we get the results on that. We'll share them.
Thank you.
And the next one is like 2 alternative ways of presenting the accounts.
Yeah, and I think we recognised last time that the trust accounts are complicated and complying with the charity SORP is complicated, and undertaking to try and make them much more accessible to the non-accountant. And we have a new, a relatively newly appointed Director of Resources, and she comes with a great deal of accounting expertise and experience. We are also looking at examples of accounts published in other ways. So it is a work in progress because the year has just finished. We will be certainly trying to work in presenting information as graphically as possible. I mean, apologies, there still will be all the technical detail that goes with SORP accounts, but that is spectacular. But certainly we're committed to make the accounts much more accessible to the non-accountant. So it's a work in progress without that.
Thanks.
And the next one we had a discussion about holding a general meeting for members and non-members, so outside of the AGM.
Yeah, okay. The straightforward way to hold a members' meeting is for a number of members to give us a resolution that we want to discuss at a members' meeting, and then we will call them. And the alternative is, of course, at our annual general meetings. So that's the way that any members can come together and call a meeting, and we will hold a meeting and discuss whatever proposal and proposition is put to the meeting. When we don't have those formal propositions to discuss, our way of communicating and discussing with members and the wider community about issues and strategic developments is these public forums. So when we don't have a formal resolution, we'll continue to hold these public fora. But when the members come together and give us a proposal, we'll call a public meeting accordingly. Sorry, a members meeting. Company meeting.
Okay, so the next one was a discussion about the stables and they're being reinstated, and Sarah Reeves, some of you will know, said that there have been some emails from Alan Bryan related to the stables and to the council in terms of stopping the development. So we haven't received them from Sarah yet, but we'll keep chasing them. Then the next one was around toilets at Acklam Road. So there was a commitment to look into the cost of reinstating the toilets on Acklam Road, which would serve the market, community events, etc. And then the final one was for Matt in our comms team to share copies of email newsletters with information about page 20 of the Portobello scheme. The discussion was around whether people had the opportunity to respond to the planning documents that were submitted for Bay 20 and for Development.
So we've gone back through the newsletters that were sent out for the past 2.5 years, I think, and we've got printouts of them up there for anybody who wants them. I've also got links, so if anyone would like electronic copies of those, I can forward those on by email.
Also copies of the notes from the last meeting at the front and the action points, and there was an audio recording of the last meeting on the website as well.
Did you want me to say something about where the developments on the reinstatement of the toilets?
Yes, please.
So, I mean, there were two potential routes. If you remember, there was, for those of us who were at the last meeting, there was a suggestion that the community could get together and, a few £100 and, willingness, we could get the toilets back up and running. I mean, in the space next to the toilets, of course, we have in Bay 56, One Voice, Westway, I think it's One Voice Community Collective officially, who are 10%. We've spoken to them about if they think the community can get things going, give us a proposition. I mean, we're open to that. But on the other side, there is a great demand, we hear it from the community, to look at bringing the toilets back into commission. So separately from that, we are undertaking a cost review to see what the cost would be. So we can consider it. It'll be certainly more than a few £100.
Are these the toilets for the market traders?
Yeah.
Not for the general public?
Well, they would be. They would be available on market days. How they
because it used to be, weren't they just for the market traders originally?
Well, I think they were open on market days.
I see.
But first of all, it's how much is it going to cost to get them back, because they haven't been operating. I think they've been operating for a couple of years, and all the time I've been with the trust. And once we understand that, we've also got to look at how we run things. So that's another separate issue. But this first point is, let's see if it's actually cost effective. I mean, look, anything can be done for price, but we're trying to understand what that price would be. And again, whether there's an alternative option, talking to other community about bringing them back into operation.
Thank you. Everyone happy with the update?
Yeah, can I just
Question?
add, we desperately need toilets there, for people that use that space. I mean, for example, Committing Arts had been given a grant for the Winter Festival from you, which was awesome, and we ran a series of workshops in Ackling Village Market as well. Don't let us use the space, but you can imagine with children, young people, families, they need toilets. We had no toilets, so we were doing contemporary dance, ballroom, all the rest in there. Ethiopian dance and poetry, art, they need toilets. It was after school hours. It's definitely like a hygiene matter, health and safety, everything, the whole thing. You really need toilets.
This isn't a small issue. I mean, it's a really important.
We
recognise it's really important. I mean, there should have been the portaloos there, because Dermot has 4 and we pay for 4 more, so they should have been there. But if we can bring the other things back into play, then we don't need to hire them. Again, there'll be a question of how do they get run when you have events, but that can be dealt with.
And I'm not sure how long the transition is until you create the new space, but in the meantime, you definitely need toilets in all of those centres there where One Voice are using and everything, because they have events, they have community stuff. There's no toilets. We need toilets,
There are portaloos, but it's not an ideal solution. No, we're well heard.
For the community, apart from the market traders, we need toilets here, we really.
Okay. So progress on that one at the next meeting? Okay, great.
The next meeting's tomorrow, so I don't think...
Sorry, the next cycle of meetings.
Yeah, definitely.
We haven't plenty. Sorry. Any other comments or questions? No? Good. In which case, shall we hand over to Barney? Barney, you're going to...
Fantastic, yes, and there's some handouts actually, so let me go and
Thank you.
grab those. Just pass those around. Great, so thanks Jim. As I mentioned, I work for a company called Hatch Regeneris. We specialise in economic and social research. We specialise in We're very much focused in London, and we kind of specialise in undertaking research into London's local places, economies and communities. We've been established for the last 12 years or so. And about 6 months ago, for the past 6 months, we've been working with the Westway Trust to undertake some detailed analysis into the characteristics of the North Kensington community and also mapping of service delivery across the North Kensington area to inform the future strategy development for the Westway Trust. Just turning over on the first page, as I say, the background to the research was that, obviously the Trust, as we know, has been very well established for a long time within North Kensington. Obviously, we know that there's been some challenges over the past 5 years, both organisationally but within the kind of wider area context, not least with Grenfell. So our scope was really to undertake a really granular mapping of kind of the local context to better inform future strategy. There's a lot in here. I'm just going to present a bit of an overview of some of the emerging findings so far. The research is still ongoing, and really keen to get perspectives from the room here on things we might miss, things you don't agree with, things you do agree with. I say that there's a lot in here, so feel free to interrupt as I go along if you're not sure about anything, and we've also got some questions at the end where Jim's going to facilitate some discussion around, hopefully. So, broadly speaking, I won't go into the detail of our approach, but our approach is largely twofold. We start off by doing a detailed statistical baseline of the local area, drawing on all the available government data and local authority data that you'd expect to see to really understand the area from a data perspective. And then on top of that, undertaking a fairly detailed consultation exercise, which is still underway, focusing on speaking to representatives from across the North Kensington community, nominated both by members of the Trust, but also from local councillors, but also from the consultees that we spoke to. So very much a kind of snowball effect in terms of the people that we've spoken to. I think, as I've already mentioned, there's probably two elements to the research. The first is about understanding the community, so the people, the places and the economy, and then the second part is about understanding who's delivering what in the area. So we know that there's a really complex and large-scale context of service delivery, a really large number of organisations active in the area, and within our work we wanted to understand who was delivering what, where the gaps are, where the overlaps are, and then obviously that needs to inform how the Westway Trust approaches its own activities in the future to ensure it can join up and value adding approach. Just overleaf on the slide, sorry, rather unhelpfully these aren't numbered, but North Kensington's places and communities, and this just provides a snapshot of some of the headline messages coming out. When we started off our research, given the complexity of the area and the challenge that we're considering, we needed to come up with a framework to consider how best to understand all these different elements of North Kensington, and we decided to focus on this approach of focusing on social well-being, which is all about North Kensington's people and communities, economic well-being, which is all about the character and vitality of the local economy, and then environmental well-being, which, as you'd expect, is much more focused on the place, the environment, and the quality of spaces across the area. And that just provides a broad framework to underpin our research. I think at the overarching level, some of the key messages coming out are that there's an incredible amount of potential within the local community, but there are significant barriers which are stopping people from maximising their talent. We know that there are overarching challenges of social isolation. We'll come on to that more in a moment. Distrust and anger, particularly since Grenfell. There are, within certain parts of the community, some very particular challenges around skills levels, particularly basic skills levels needed for employment and to get into employment. Housing, as we know, not just because of Grenfell, but before that and long into the future, is a major issue. It's true in North Kensington, it's true across London. There are some really significant health challenges, particularly around mental health and depression, but also around nutrition and exercise, and we'll come on to those more in a moment as well. But then also, really importantly, that we don't just consider North Kensington as a single place. It's incredibly diverse. So our framework for our research was to focus on the Westway Trust sphere of influence, which is the 5 wards which make up North Kensington, and in drilling down, there are some really significant variations even within North Kensington as well. I think as an overarching message, we work across London, and a lot of the challenges being faced within North Kensington and coming out from the data and consultation aren't dissimilar to other places in London. What is different here is a lot of those challenges have been brought to the fore by Grenfell and what's happened since, and it's really been brought to the fore and made some of those challenges all the more severe. So those are some of the headline messages. Just overleaf, and this is where we start to get much more into the detail, thinking about those 3 themes: social, economic and environmental well-being. And don't worry, I'm not going to read this out word for word. Jim won't let me, there's not quite enough time. But within each of these themes, we split that quite broad topic into a number of sub-areas. So for social well-being, looking at skills and employment, health, social participation, and personal stability and prosperity. And then within each of those, there are a number of sub-areas as well, reflecting the complexity of some of these issues. So in terms of skills and employment, the data, looking first at the data tells us that performance in the schools is a little bit below the kind of London and national averages in terms of progress. And from the kind of economic participation perspective, there are some very significant challenges within the area in terms of levels of economic participation, so the number of people who are economically active or actually in work as well. So the data is quite telling in that respect, and then what the community have told us so far really builds upon that, and emphasising the point that there are a lot of people who are very willing and want to be economically active, but they need better support to be able to achieve that. In terms of training, there's quite a clear message coming out around the gap between training opportunities and skills needed. So some need for some more focused training opportunities, particularly in kind of vocational sectors, which we know is a challenge nationally at the moment. Basic skills around language skills, English, maths, as well, and job readiness skills was a big message coming out. Some quite clear messages as well about young people who want to access work experience opportunities and opportunities to just establish those first links into work as well, but who are struggling to make that connection at the moment. And then another clear message coming through, which also crops up elsewhere in the research, was a common message around the lack of affordable after-school care, well, pre or after-school care for young people, and that obviously affects young people, but also impacts upon parents who want to access employment themselves as well. So some quite clear challenges. In terms of health, the data in terms of health is really quite stark. Between the north and south of Kensington, as we know, very different socioeconomically, and it's telling in the data that there's some very different life expectancy figures between the north and the south of the borough, and also some quite telling stats as well about depression and mental health within patients registered within GP surgeries within the North Kensington area. That data actually preceded Grenfell as well, which is all the more worrying. The data for the last 2 years hasn't yet been made available. So depression and mental health is a clear challenge, and really does mark out the area compared to other places that we've been looking at in London as well. Some quite culturally specific challenges that you'd expect in a very diverse area as well, and as we know from the rise of food banks, food poverty is a really crucial challenge. And just finally as well, on this, a really common theme was a kind of feeling that there's a lack of affordable access to spaces for people to educate, exercise and play sports as well. So I'm conscious that there's a lot in here and a lot of messages coming out, so do feel free to stop me at any point if you've got any questions, but if not, I'll carry on through and there's a chance for a wider discussion at the end.
Just ask a question about the mental health?
Absolutely.
You said about, particularly in very young ages as well, but was it found more in a certain age group, or?
So The data from the NHS doesn't distinguish between age groups for that specific indicator, and when people via the consultation were telling us about it, it wasn't necessarily age specific. It was more common across all ages. It's probably something we could go back at and have a look at there in terms of the data, just to see if we can drill down a little bit more. I'm pretty sure
that question.
Well, I just feel like it is relevant because obviously if you've got, from my perspective, from the organisation that I work with, we work with older people. When I say older, from 50 to 106, so it's quite a big spectrum. But
redefined.
yeah, exactly. But I think that obviously if we know, as an organisation that provides activities and we have employment and we've got exercise classes and art classes, if we know that there is a certain part of the borough that actually is suffering with mental health problems because actually they need to be engaged in their community, then they can be signposted to an organisation like us. So I do think age is relevant here.
Absolutely. And it's, I mean, we as part of the research had a really insightful discussion with the local CCG, the NHS CCG, who obviously have all the information data to hand. I don't know if you're linked in, you are already. So, but I think, you know, as part of the next steps, the research, you know, the Westway Trust will be considering how it can better work with other local organisations to facilitate links and conversations and partnerships, and so hopefully the information coming across in this can help to signpost conversations and link in.
Generally, the local CCG is very focused on over 65.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So through the My Care My Way, those people are probably getting referred in, but I think it's the younger age groups. And there's anecdotally you hear of young mums struggling, and the first thing the GP gives them is antidepressants.
Unfortunately, but already does some amazing work in the area. I don't know how
it's knowing
connected with already, you know.
Barney's made a note to do further research and dig into that data.
Already? We will look at that.
Facilitators are getting
there's a huge amount of...
Which organisations you can work with to address this population.
Absolutely, Okay, great. Overleaf, social participation, which covered a really broad range of issues and challenges from isolation, young people engagement and trust. I think there's some quite again quite stark data around kind of crime in the area and the kind of perceptions of crime and issues around gang violence as well, which comes out both through the data but also from what the kind of community consultation have told us. I mean, I think language is clearly a really significant issue. If you look at the last census from 2011, I think the stats suggested that around 70% of kind of residents, English was their first language, whereas the latest school census suggests it's less than 50%. And you know, whilst they're two different data sets, it really shows the changing population, and language really is a common challenge within the area. In terms of what the community have told us, I mean, social isolation and loneliness across all age groups, but particularly kind of the elderly age groups was a theme which is coming out, particularly from minority communities and those speaking different languages. Some quite interesting thoughts about physical isolation. So whilst we're in inner London and relatively well connected, there are elements of the community which actually feel quite peripheral and disconnected as well, which was an interesting finding.
You might want to make a note of transport then next to that, particularly with old people, they have issues accessing it.
Yeah, and if you go up to, you know, the kind of far reach of the Dardano estate, for example, you know, you are incredibly, you know, it's in public transport accessibility terms, it's quite weak, poor links. I think a lot of discussion about young people being left without support due to cuts in kind of RBKC and kind of other core services over recent years. And I think just generally cutting across this category, a general sense of kind of distrust and lack of trust in institutions and organisations working in the area. So whilst there is a lot of capacity and a lot of people doing good things, there's a feeling of a lack of a joined up approach and a kind of sense that people know where to go when they need support. Personal stability and prosperity, this covers everything from financial security, housing security, access to support. I've already mentioned that household, housing is a really significant challenge in the area. I mean, average income levels in the area are comparatively low, and another indicator of relative deprivation is kind of the kind of free school meals. People's eligible for free school meals, and it's a relatively high proportion here. So we know there are challenges around household income, and that's become particularly even more marked over the past decade with kind of cuts in public sector funding and closure of more local services such as the credit union, which was referenced on a number of occasions. I think more generally the issue of housing, which is obviously a much bigger issue, both within Kensington but also across London and nationally, really came up as a massive issue. Obviously, particularly marked here since Grenfell and the challenges in rehousing, but certainly something which affects prosperity and inclusion across the whole of the community as a whole. Economic well-being. This covers three broad areas, so enterprise, so ability of people to kind of set up businesses and run and grow businesses, the overall vitality and diversity of the local economy, and then just as importantly, the idea of business responsibility, so our businesses in the area taking a kind of responsible approach in terms of how they're going about
Just to
business.
maximise our time for discussion, Barney, do you want to give us the headlines from that particular page, 2 or 3?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of enterprise, one of the biggest challenges, as is the case across London, is the lack of affordable workspace. It's a challenge seen across London, and obviously it really acts as a massive constraint in terms of the ability of people to start up businesses. Spaces like the temporary affordable workspace provided by the Westway Trust have been well received, but there's a sense that there's not enough of those, and that they're not visible enough. In terms of economic vitality and diversity, it's clearly an area where we've got some very local services and amenities focused on the local community, but also the kind of regionally significant kind of specialist retail of Portobello Road and the festival, and a sense of a bit of a disconnect between the two, and a sense that more could be done to kind of curate a kind of more vibrant economy, but also importantly the link of arts and culture cutting across the piece, and how that can be used to engage local people as well. And finally, just on business responsibility, I mean, it's very difficult because there's not a huge amount of data, but it's just a common theme which is coming up increasingly across our work in London, and the need for businesses to be responsible in terms of their employment practices, be it the London living wage or committing to recruiting fairly and openly, committing to working with local supply chains, and the idea that as a major local landowner, the Westway Trust can play a really important role in curating better business across the area.
Can I just quickly say something, just because obviously I'm a new CIC, which is enterprises and stuff, and I had briefly mentioned it to Phil. Remember when I said to you that I saw something on your website a long time ago that Westway supported, like financially supported new startups? I don't know if anyone's aware of it, but it still is actually on the website. So there was some sort of a fund where you supported new startups in their first 6 months, in their first year, etc. So I'm just wondering if that's something you would consider bringing back again, because it would really help. I love the new funds that are offered now with the development fund, the artist commissioning and all the rest. I think it's so important, and it's great you've got that in place, because we really do need it. We've got so much talent in the area, but it's not supported enough with regards to guidance, advice, finances. But for startups, something like that would so be useful.
We'd like to respond on that.
And especially non-profits as well, people that help with young people, because
well,
the business completely
I think that's going to
disappears.
some of the stuff that's coming out of the report is the
Yeah.
for startups, and how we'll talk about our grant making, I guess, a bit later. But I mean, clearly, I think it's an important area. So I think traditionally we focused on charities. And the set up of CICs rather than the set up of new businesses.
Well, I'm talking about CICs and non-profits, not profit makers.
And I think part of what's come out of the work that Hatch have done is that how the trust not only invests in the community financially, but in terms of resources to potentially help support organisations. So that could be that we're providing our time as opposed to, as well as potentially our money. So it could be that a lot of organisations need to support to set up, how they do their accounts, fundraising, marketing, whatever that might be.
Because a lot of us are clueless with that, and you know, we'll go, you know, only recently some of us found out about Tom Fitch, but again, he's so busy, you know, there's not many staff in his company as well. So yeah, definitely, like with regards to the finances in the space, because especially if you're a non-profit, how are you going to pay for the space, even if it's subsidised? Unless we've applied for a fund, it's just for an event or a project. But we're talking about core running costs for the year, you know, support with that for the first year, for the first 2 years, especially for local, you know, we were born and raised here, we're doing like artistic, innovative work to help the community. It would be great to have that more supported by the Westway with regards to advice, finances, with, you know, and space.
Where does Portobello Business Centre doesn't provide that? For
a little bit. They sort of, they kind of help, but they don't help you financially or with space. They sort of give you advice on how to set up a business, and they're more so orientated towards like businesses rather than like non-profits. Because I remember going to Portobello Business Centre probably about 15 to 20 years ago, and because I didn't feel it connected to the work that I do, which is like performing arts in the community and stuff, just all went above my head and I didn't do nothing. And only in the past few years did I find out that, for example, the Social Council helped quite a lot of things like that. And then only a year ago did I find out that someone called Tom Fitch is based at the Westway and helps, you know, people start up charities and CICs, hence why we now are a CIC. But you know, definitely we need that in place.
Helpful. Thank you very much indeed for that. Bob?
Great. Final theme, slide 8, page 8 there, environmental well-being, and this covers air and noise pollution and public realm and open space. I mean, in terms of air and noise pollution, the data, you know, tells us that there is a big air quality challenge, as we'd expect, given the kind of Westway running through the area. More generally, you know, people telling us that they want a cleaner and kind of greener and safer environment. A concern that some schools don't want to use the sports centre because of concerns around the air quality. And I think more generally just the sense that there's a lack of a common approach to lobbying on behalf of the local community in support of these issues, which obviously is something which needs to be addressed at the regional level rather than the very local level. In terms of public space and open realm, some parts of the area have limited access to open spaces, whilst there's some very large and kind of regionally significant open spaces kind of around the area. There are parts of the area which are a little bit constrained, and quite a lot of feedback in terms of initiatives and actions which could be done to improve and green spaces in and around the Westway itself, and that's something which is being taken forward separately as part of the Westway urban design strategy at the moment, so I won't go into detail on that now. The second part of our work was to consider service delivery in North Kensington, and as a kind of first stage of that, it was really to try to map out all the different organisations and groups active in the area. Now, we could never be fully comprehensive with this just because there are so many. I think broadly speaking, we identified 3 main groups. There's kind of strategic and statutory bodies, be it the police, the CCG, and the council itself. You've then got organisations who are providing services on a thematic basis, so be it Job Centres Plus, CAB, charities such as Mind and Age UK. Some of those are nationally focused with a local footprint, some of those are locally focused with a local footprint, and then also place-based and place-specific organisations and groups and spaces which are all responding to different local needs. So incredibly complex, but you know, positive as well. You know, there's an incredible amount of resource here. I think a common message coming out is that perhaps sometimes that resource isn't that well organised, and that there's a bit of overlap in certain instances. There are occasions where that resource isn't being used as efficiently as it could be to kind of maximise the kind of communal potential of that. Just overleaf is a bit of a mapping of some of the local community organisations. I think you won't be able to read it, but there's 88 on there, and that's not, we're not trying to be comprehensive with that. There will be more. Yeah, there will be a large amount more than that. But just some of the kind of key messages coming out over Leaf again is in terms of social wellbeing, a need for more provision of services that support people getting into work or training. So coming back to the point that we talked about earlier about people wanting to be economically active but struggling to do that. Need to better support young people and give them safe places to go where they can receive support and have fun. Cultural and location barriers, stopping people accessing specific support, particularly health, but also so kind of wider support as well, and that's true for kind of older age groups as well, as we've kind of already touched on. Sports provision was a theme that came up, and obviously the area benefits from the Westway Sports Centre, which is a fantastic resource, but a kind of feeling that that's not necessarily being accessed by as broad a range of the community as it could be at the moment. And then the point about housing, the kind of really large shortfall, both in the provision but also support for housing as well. In terms of economic well-being, as I mentioned, the kind of new workspace units are well received, but kind of feeling that there could be more of those, although I know there has been challenge in kind of letting those. So a little bit of a disconnect there, which might suggest an issue with information, but something to have a think about in more detail, and also the role that the Westway Trust plays in providing and accommodating discounted space for charities and community organisations is really well valued, in the sense that really needs to be prioritised and protected and enhanced in the future. And then, as I've already mentioned on environmental wellbeing, a sense that the current approaches to dealing with air quality is currently too fragmented and not joined up enough, and there needs to be kind of more effective and coherent lobbying of that, and likewise on open spaces and public realm, a need for kind of local organisations to work better together to deliver a kind of more coherent strategy, which the urban design strategy aims to do.
Brilliant.
So, yeah, that's a lot of information to take in.
Okay, but I'm going to ask a question now. Folks are participant people. How do you think this should inform the direction and the priorities of Westway? A lot to take in, I know, but what are your first thoughts about that? And what's your first response to what you heard?
Well, my first response as you were going through it was, as you were reading or talking about, I kept thinking, yeah, but they do that, and yeah, but that happens over there, and yeah, but that happens. And what I feel is missing is about the joined up approach with environmental. There's a lack of a joined up approach right across the board. We've got a number of good infrastructure organisations in this borough. Westway being one, so the council just said, Tom is that's an infrastructure body. So what about getting all those together to have, they fill in all the gaps, and you might have a much more coordinated, integration is the thing these days, why not integrate a bit more in the voluntary sector as well?
Absolutely. And there was a really positive meeting a few weeks ago with leaders from some of those organisations where we discussed some of the emerging findings from this, and it was a really positive discussion.
And everybody and their brother is doing a consultation at the minute, doing a listening exercise. I'm the trustee of the Kensington Chelsea Foundation, and they've done their own listening exercise. And all that's great, but somewhere we need to bring that all together and say, your best place to do this, your best place to support that.
Do you have any vision of how that could happen?
Get them on the table.
Well, I think it's interesting. So we had this presentation to our board last week, and Angela Spence is on our board. She's the chief executive of the Social Council, and she really welcomed this report. And I think it will help. I think probably with us and them, possibly the council as well.
Yeah.
We can do together, bring people together, and work out. Everybody's role to play. One of the things that has come out of conversations we've been having about this, and it talks to your point actually, is this. There's the council that's delivering stuff. Westway's delivering some things. There's other voluntary sector bodies are delivering certain aspects of this. But there's also a big emerging group of people like you who are CICs or startups who want to play a role and can play a role and are playing a role need a little bit of extra support to actually fill some of these gaps. So rather than us think Westway, oh, we can do that, we can, we should be delivering on all of these things. Actually, potentially, and we haven't got to this completely with our board yet, but potentially, is our role really there to be enabling others to then fill those gaps? So can we support with money and space and expertise to support those groups to be sustainable, to actually fill those gaps? So it's the community groups coming forward and that capacity being built up.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a really sustainable way. I mean,
the discussion about should Westway be an enabler of providers and on the for 50 years. At least 50 years. And the truth is it's both.
Yes.
Okay.
It can be both. Yes.
It's well placed in some areas to start something off and then boom, off it goes. And others to enable other people to do it. And in some areas like the sports centre, you do it yourself. So I think
it's a mix.
It's got to be quite flexible.
Other thoughts?
I'd just say, like, the Westway Arts Network aims to do this. But just an idea, I think if Westway Trust, with your database of different organisations and different groups of people and heads of CICs and charities, etc., if you can maybe reach out to these people and invite them, rather than just doing like a big poster saying this is happening, but individually invite people so that someone like Tom is at the meeting, someone from the social council definitely is going to be at the meeting, someone from whatever, Community Arts, Age UK, whoever, you make sure they are at that meeting, then these people will get to interact with each other, get to know each other and see how they can support each other. I think it's when you don't have all the different people from the community at the same meeting, that's what happens. So if you individually reach out to people, do your marketing too.
Jason and Chelsea Social Council, they do a thing you have to register, don't they, for an event. So maybe that's the way forward, and you've got, exactly who is attending on the list, and then,
But no one has all the information. You've got to reach out.
I'm just saying, invite them. So we would like you there because it would help the community rather than just saying this is happening, register. Because people just go, or they just come. Ad hoc, they just whenever.
Other thoughts?
Can I just say, or ask, would that really be effective if you're not actually sure how you're going to be working yourselves? What model you're going to be working to? Sure, it seems like you're putting the cart before the horse by saying that you do that without actually knowing how you'll function as an organisation.
What do you mean in relation to... I mean, we're just exploring our role and how our role might change and evolve, and the question is, should we play more of an enabling role alongside the social council and the council and other voluntary sector to provide, support people in a different way, which is through resources and space and expertise, rather than just delivering the services directly ourselves and giving out grants and, potentially having slightly new
basically saying if you're not actually certain what you are as an organisation, how can you deliver?
It must be evolving.
So what your offer is?
Yeah, and I think that's why we're having this, this discussion and many others about where we might prioritise.
I think it's interesting because we're talking about the action we have to look at the membership structures and that sort of thing, what sort of organisation we are. But we think this sort of research on what is the need, what role can we play, could also influence the sort of membership structure we should have. So I don't think it's one thing or the other. We need to be embedded and responsive and informed and part of the local community, delivering what services and what our role is, and having membership structures that tie into those roles. So I think it goes together. I don't think it's one thing and then the other, but certainly these things will emerge and develop together.
Other people's reactions. Other people's reactions as you were hearing Barney talk there. What's going on in your head, Junior?
I was just thinking about, well, you mentioned that there's not enough affordable space for early businesses. Yeah. How would you acquire that? would you basically repurpose the building, or would you like build something from scratch?
So there's lots of different ways it can be done. I guess one of the benefits that the Westway Trust has is space, and it has space, which it has a number of different mechanisms to lease out space to commercial tenants and to charity and community tenants, and so part of the future strategy could be to consider whether there's demand for kind of space, affordable workspace for businesses, whether that's focused on CICs or kind of local startups, but that is actually one of the tools that the trust itself has at its disposal, which makes it distinctive from probably most other organisations in the local area. That is one of the things which makes the trust highly distinctive.
Was there anything that you heard Barney talking about that made you go, sharp intake of breath, that should be a higher priority for Westway?
I felt that a lot of it couldn't happen with Westway alone, that there needs to be a community-wide approach to dealing with it. There are certain areas of it that are out of your control, but you could facilitate, if you want, community spaces for the meetings, for instance. So it's having those partners, having partnership with the local authority, with the health authority, for instance, to facilitate all that is where you should come from, but it's not something that you could do in isolation.
Barney, looking at that in comparison to other local areas in London, what jumps out at you as being the...
Yeah, so as I said at the start, at face level, a lot of these challenges are things that you see elsewhere across London. I think the two things which mark North Kensington out, as I mentioned, are obviously the kind of recent context of Grenfell, but also linked to that the kind of real groundswell of kind of capacity within the area in terms of the sheer number of organisations and people trying to do good things. So, which provides a fantastic opportunity, but also a bit of a risk as well, because you get people, there is a sense that there is some conflict in terms of, certain organisations, repeating what others are doing, and in terms of concern that some organisations are getting funding and others aren't as well. So it is an opportunity, but it's a risk. I think actually, and I think this is true of the Westway team as well, actually, as we've been working through this both from the data perspective but also the consultation perspective, there hasn't been that much here which has surprised us, but that's how it should be, because you guys are based in the local area and working in the local area and embedded in the local area, and so actually it should be reassuring that here are common messages that you all know. I think the value in this work from our perspective, and hopefully from the Westway Trust perspective, is that it provides a very in-depth and granular evidence base which provides a kind of shared basis and platform for kind of future working, and that's hopefully not just the case for the trust as well, but I think there's value in as this evolves, other local organisations contributing to a shared evidence base, so everyone is working from the same basis in terms of the evidence, and that just informs better discussions and a better starting point for discussions about how organisations work together and take forward actions. So to give a long, convoluted response.
Okay, yeah. Any other questions for Barney? Any other questions on this research?
Sorry. How did you approach the community representatives and leaders when you were forming this research?
Yeah.
Because I don't know, did you get in touch with anyone from OKH?
I'm not actually sure that we did. So, and it's worth saying that the engagement process is still kind of open as well. So we've kind of gone through, probably. And happy certainly to pick up a conversation.
I've been more than happy to meet with you. It's just that it seems surprising to me because we've been going for 25 years and have 5,000 members, 2,000 of which are based in Kensington, probably alone. So I think that would probably be quite relevant to your research.
Absolutely. So we've said all along that it's a process which is evolving. So we've been recommended some people, and it absolutely hasn't meant to be a kind of closed.
Something about matching up, because you've got a lot of talent out there, a lot of people doing stuff. You can see it's about identifying the gaps, and then are there, I would say with older people, I have to say, I think older people fairly well.
Comparatively.
But young entrepreneurs, not so much. So where are the gaps? Who's got the right capacity to address those, you know, to really make the most of those assets that are already there in the community.
And I also think as well for Age UK and Open Age, a lot of people do get us into
Yeah,
big
yeah,
organisations.
Yeah. Okay, well we can, if I can take your details after that.
Do you see any other solutions emerging elsewhere in London to address this issue of looking at the assets that are in the community and producing
Absolutely. We didn't include it in here today, but as part of our work, we've been doing quite a lot of looking at kind of examples from elsewhere, learning from elsewhere, both from a engaging young people perspective, but also from a kind of workspace perspective, and that there's some kind of really interesting models of kind of workspace elsewhere in London where different uses are being used to cross-subsidise other uses. So some really interesting examples in Brixton, for example, where there's some kind of really high, some uses and activities which can afford to pay very high market values for space, and via the income which being generated by those uses, it's being used to subsidise space for kind of small startup businesses, but also within that models where all kind of businesses within that space are asked to commit to providing a kind of social commitments, which in that case I'm thinking of Pop Brixton, which you might be familiar with. All businesses there have to give, I think it's either 1 or 2 hours a week to local community time, and it's not just painting a wall, it's actually mentoring and kind of actual practical time, which can be used either an hour at a time or pooled together to provide kind of more comprehensive solutions. So that's an interesting model, both from a kind of leasing of space perspective, but also in terms of community give back perspective as well. And again, I think that's directly applicable to the Westway Trust, because as the big landlord here, you have a direct say over what you're asking of your tenants.
Is it worth, Marie and Phil, sorry to put you on the spot, but just because you went to see Participatory City, which is based in Barking and Dagenham, which is another kind of model, isn't it? That you've highlighted to us, where it just talks to your point again about how we can support organisations, individuals with ideas that don't really have much money, but just need a bit of resource to get them started. And there was quite an interesting model there. Do you want to just share? I think that's be quite...
So it's a very wide vision of like in Dagenham, and they're kind of like a platform. So they have this amazing warehouse space that have just opened when we went, and they've got like hot desking space, with a community kitchen, they've got like an upcycling area, they've got a tech area, the clay, everything that kind of, brings people together. And then they have these 5 shops around the borough. So the participants, you go into a shop and you want to do a project. So they don't determine what any of the projects are, but the participants go into a shop and say, I've always wanted to like do photography, or I have skills in photography and I want to share them. And then Participatory City play the role of, they take away what would normally be the barrier, which is space, it is permission, it is sometimes funding. So they do all of that to enable the projects to happen. It's a very well funded, it's kind of like a research project into a borough-wide approach to change the outcomes for the whole borough. There's a lot of political buy-in from the council, all of the big funders like Big Lottery, Esme Fair and City Village Trust all invested in it as a new approach.
Yeah, and what they're interested in measuring is what impact having conversation and participation can have on people's well-being. That's socially, in terms of their health. So I think the idea is that the more people are involved in talking to each other within the local community, that will improve their health and well-being.
That'd be great for us to model something like that. I know Kensington Aldridge have started something like that with regards to letting community groups or people with great ideas use their space. I'm not sure how subsidised it is, or sometimes it's even, in kind, as long as they give free mentoring and tuition to their students, which is, post-Grenfell, and since they've relocated it, which is great. And I think definitely with the amount of space and resources that Westway have, especially when these spaces are not being used, you could do something like that, whether it's subsidised or in kind, as long as we give back to the community. Why not?
I think, I think that's really interesting. I think the other person example which we've come across is and mentioned is a project called Volunteer It Yourself, which is all about kind of using training up young people in kind of DIY and vocational building trades, kind of and encouraging volunteering by basically doing community spaces. And actually, I was thinking about this when you were talking about the toilets earlier. So the model there is that DIY is partly funded by Wix, who provide all the building materials for free. So the young people volunteer their time, they actually do the work, and then they're kind of guided by professional tradespeople who act as mentors, volunteer mentors to guide the people to do the work. And it's called Volunteer It Yourself, and it starts out kind of in 2011. It's kind of really scaled up rapidly, and I think it's just a really good example of kind of seeing space and kind of renovating space, which could be a kind of an opportunity within the Westway Trust, but also actually getting young people to participate in that as well.
I think we have a lot of creative people around, and people who want to start their businesses, that kind of thing. But we also have people who just need good jobs that are going to enable them to look after their families, and getting into the trades that, whether it is work, building, catering, all that sort of thing, where you can make a career out of that. And too many of my neighbours doing Deliveroo and Uber, really, it's in my, done it since they were little, and
secure
better than Deliveroo.
Like people like degrees and stuff, and they resort to something like that, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's so risky and stuff. I've seen so many of them on the ground when they get knocked over. But I just think, getting people into those skills, the apprenticeships. We used to have vocational training. We seem to think that's not worth it anymore. So that kind of thing.
We've been doing an evaluation of that project, and it showed some kind of help, progression for young people in terms of kind of work readiness, confidence skills as well, but also benefits for the adult mentors who might either be working or out of work, but helping them to kind of engage with young people and build confidence around kind of teaching and projects. So lots of quite interesting projects out there which have relevance, I think.
Okay.
I was just going to quickly say Creative Futures has recently reopened for that, so that's great. My only concern is two things with that. One is how do you basically get the other 50%? So Westway are funding 50% of the employees' fees as an intern, which is great because like Committing Arts, we need interns, but it's like how do you match the other 50% if you're not a profit-making business, for example, and then also the space. If Westway are able, for example, to offer a space where the new CICs or startups can work with the interns, and definitely some advice on where we get the 50% from. Because I was just like, we're going to get match funded. It's like, someone like Kensington Chelsea Foundation, would they sort of match fund the intern employees' wage, for example, because then that will give them experience and sort of add to their skills and open up opportunities for their future work, etc. But that is definitely a big question. I'm still to meet with, is it Diane? Yeah, because...
Thank you for that. I'd like to welcome our guest. So your name was?
Isis.
So hello Isis, it's Jim, facilitator. And we won't do the introductions there, but shake hands afterwards.
Well, I think I know, with the exception of maybe 3. Yeah, I think I know everyone there.
Brilliant. Okay, so what I'd like to do is draw a close on that one. Thank you very much indeed, Barney. Very, very useful, very interesting. We won't launch you straight into your bit, if that's all right. Isis. We'll give you a moment to acclimatise to the lovely warm room that we're in. In the meantime, are there any open issues? So a bit of open space really, just anything you want to say, anything you want to bring up, any points of discussion or topics you'd like to offer? Blimey, it's amazing. Anything, Emmanuel? Anything you'd like to offer?
I think I've mentioned quite a lot really.
You certainly have. I'm just trying to squeeze the orange to see if there's any more. That's what I'm trying to do. Good. Listen, if there's no more, then we won't use time unnecessarily. We will bring it on to ISIS. ISIS, would you like to give us a quick idea of what you're going to talk about, and then talk about it?
Do you want me to give some context?
Please do.
Rather than you.
I mean, I'm happy however you want to do it, Phil.
Just
cool.
So I think last year the Trust set up a new committee, the Charitable Purposes Committee, of which Cynthia sits on. Basically, I suppose, to review our charitable purposes and to look at how effective some of our work is. So one of the first things that the committee is looking at is our grant making. So I think the Trust has been a grant maker for for a number of years, but our grant making is quite transactional in the sense that we set priorities and pretty much make the decisions, and then that's funneled down to the people who are applying for our grants. So I think what we are interested in as a charity, and particularly the CPC, is to review the ways in which we give our grants. And we're quite interested in piloting an approach around what's called participatory grantmaking, so that the decision making is devolved. So as part of that, we're working with two people, Isis and another lady called Anne Sanders, who both have a long track record and long history in this kind of work. So basically, we've tasked Isis and Anne to look at how we, as a trust, can develop a model around participatory grantmaking. So I think Isis was going to talk about what participatory marketing could be and some of its pros and cons.
Yes. Marvellous, thank you. Yes.
So, obviously with the exception of the Westway Trust people, has everyone here heard of participatory grant making? No? Anyone? No? Okay.
I've heard of it, yes.
Yeah, okay. So, I think following on from what Phil's saying, essentially it's a different way of giving funding to organisations, predominantly organisations, but it can also be individuals in certain circumstances, for them to run a project. It could be some sort of at the moment Westway does funding for arts. They also we do funding for social change as well, I suppose we call it. You're not too happy with that, Mark?
Yeah.
Speak now,
Events and community events.
Yeah. So, yeah. Community events and for arts activities. So the participatory grant making is another way of doing it, where I think Phil has started off talking about it. Rather than decision making always being in the hands of the funder, or in some cases the donor, the person giving the money, you flip the script essentially and you put it in the hands of the people who are applying for the funding, the people who are the donees or the recipients of the grant. So it's a different way of doing it. It's probably been around for quite a number of years. I came to participatory grant making because of my role in One Voice, which you were a member of, and we applied for some money to do community monitoring of the police, and we wanted to get money that wasn't connected to any sort of authority. We wanted, it was about a political decision about where we took funding from. And through my activist network, I've got a background many years as an activist, I saw something called the Edge Fund, and it spoke about giving money for political causes, and because of the nature of what we were doing, we thought this made a good match, and they said they were doing it differently, with a different way of doing funding. So I went along and we got some funding to do that work. The model that the Edge Fund uses is that everyone who receives a grant becomes a member of the Edge Fund, and you have the option of then getting involved in running the organisation. And sort of 6 years later, I'm the chair of the Edge Fund.
Wow.
It happens. I sit on the Influencing Funders group, and I'm on what we call a facilitation group. Because we're non-hierarchical, we don't have a board, so we call it a facilitation group. And it's made up of members, a couple of which are donors. Most of us have come to it through our work, and we have 2 employed members of staff. So during this period of time, I've been working in participatory grant making, and I've seen a number of models. I've worked with the Edge Fund, trying to influence larger organisations. So I was in the States some years ago, and I did some work with the Heinz Endowment. Those are the people who make the Heinz. They're a huge organisation based in Pittsburgh. I was in Barcelona a couple of years ago, sort of I was involved in running workshops and also trying to influence people like the Open Societies Foundation. I've done some work with Lankelly Chase. We've been to Tudor Trust and done some stuff. So I've been wearing that hat. My ethos has been to try and get other large funding organisations to relinquish power to the hands of the people who we say with lived experience. So a good example would be, there's a group in Manchester made up of, they're called African Rainbow Family, and they're a group of women, all of African heritage from the continent, as opposed from the diaspora. And they are all gay women, and they all face persecution. So like the woman who set it up is Nigerian. In Nigeria, it's illegal to be a gay woman. I believe some people from Tanzania, various other countries where they've had those problems. Many of them have been in detention centres because they've been fighting to stay here because it's not safe for them to return, and they set this organisation up. And so that group has been funded on a number of occasions by Edge Fund, and what that means is that those women who themselves understand the experiences that they're trying to change are in control of the funds. So that's an example of some of the groups. Now there are other groups that do work that's much more sort of arts focused. That's obviously more political and campaigning. There's other groups that do much sort of like you were saying, Mark, which is much more about community stuff. So it could be about doing something for children, or I don't know, working with older people. So much more kind of social care based kind of activities. There are a number of advantages and disadvantages. I mean, I'm biased, but I see more advantages to putting funding in the hands of people who want to make changes themselves. I mean, we talk about systemic change, we're talking about transformation, we're talking about fairer, more equal societies, all that sort of thing. You find it a lot of also in environmental movements. So if I were to go through some of the pros and cons, I would say that one of the things is about the amount of money that's given. Traditionally speaking, these sorts of funds, participatory grant funding, is smaller pots of money. So at the Edge Fund we give £3,000 maximum to an organisation, and an individual in certain circumstances can get up to £1,000. I'm trying to think of other organisations. The Heinz Endowment, the project, the work that I did with them was something called the Transformative Arts Programme, which was what they call for distressed neighbourhoods, African American and distressed neighbourhoods in Pittsburgh. Well, probably Pittsburgh, which became infamous last year for what happened, but Pittsburgh, historically, the Hill District is an area where there's lots of African Americans and lots of social issues. But their thing was about giving money to artists to transform their community through art. So it wasn't sort of campaigning. Another group that I came across was which was a really interesting group, was the Red Umbrella Fund, which is a group of sex workers. So these are people who have defined themselves or redefined themselves as sex workers, and they have put funding up for them to do the kind of work that they see will benefit their situation, because it's quite a precarious situation. They face lots of issues around illegality, persecution, violence. Obviously as women, it's all women, so violence and a number of issues. So they see the campaigning work that they need to do. We did a tour. They did a sex workers tour in Barcelona for us when I was there a couple of years ago. So there are lots of different models. Then there are sort of models where people might come together in a community, and it's very much based on locality. And this is really what we're looking at, where it's about your local area rather than a campaign or a kind of identity group. And they have a lot of these schemes where people come together, and they call them like soup. I think they call them soup something or the other. And they basically, people make soup and they sit around and people present what they want to have funded, and then people make a decision. The important thing is about the participation. So in the Edge Fund, we have a process where we use chickpeas. We're known as the people who use chickpeas, and we allocate chickpeas to everyone present. Funders, if they're there, donors, if they're there, applicants who are there, all sit together. Other people who are activists who are involved, we all sit together, we hear what everybody else is doing, we take an opportunity, and then at the end of the day, literally there are pots with the names of the organisations that have applied for funding, and then people literally put the chickpeas in the pots. And the most chickpeas get the most funding, so it's a very, very simple process. So there's different ways of doing it.
The Waitrose green disc.
Yes, exactly. It's kind of like, yeah. but a bit more hippie with our chickpeas. So, there's lots of ways of doing it, but the bottom line is that what we're trying to do in these funds is to devolve power from the traditional decision makers, to give more power and recognition of kind of experience or expertise to the people applying for the money. So, if Emmanuel is applying to run workshops for poetry with young people. She's been doing this for a long time. She kind of knows what she's doing, so she's actually making a decision about that rather than somebody telling her what she should do. There are different models in terms of also how people are then asked to report back in terms of monitoring and evaluation, because traditionally, whenever we apply for funding, that can be quite onerous, and it can be, there's usually quite an expectation of how you report on how you use the money. With our Edge Fund and with some other funders, we're trying more innovative ways, so videos, doing a blog, or a video feedback, we have something called a radical sharing forum. So instead of asking people to feedback, to evaluate or monitor things, traditionally we'd bring people together and people would meet and we would discuss and they would tell us what we were doing, and so that it was a kind of verbal way, and we capture that information. We also strive to make the application process far more simple, because the idea is to break down barriers and make it more accessible. We still have many issues where some people's first language is not English. Many people have other barriers. I mean, I'm dyslexic. I know some dyslexic people, we might face issues around the quality of writing. There are some people who are literate, but actually could do amazing work, and they could be prevented from accessing. So it's about trying to make it as simple as possible and trusting in the people that are applying for the money. So it really is about thinking outside the box, and it is about setting aside what we're used to and thinking of a new way of doing it. So coming on to pros and cons, some of the difficulties with it are that some organisations are structured in such a way that because of the Charity Commission regulations, etc., they can't give money to certain things, or their processes prohibit certain ways of doing things. So one has to be clear about how our organisations are structured to do it. There is a big move towards doing this. And I mentioned the other night at the board meeting, one of the most interesting things that's come up is that some big funders or foundations have come together, Lang Kelly Chase, Tudor Trust who are local, Lloyd's, TSB and City Bridge, and they've advertised for somebody to come in and do a piece of work around developing a new process for their funding, and whether they should be doing joined up stuff, whether they should be funding differently. And I feel that, and also Joseph Rowntree. So I feel that that's really an interesting thing, because they're quite big, and I know they'll have a lot of restraints, and I think or constraints, and I think they're actually probably quite a lot bigger than Westway Trust, and so they're looking at that, and I would say that Edge Fund, we've done a lot of work with 3 of those foundations, so I would like to take some credit for the work we've been doing with them to move them in this direction. The other thing is that obviously when we're thinking about the sort of work that the Westway Trust would be funding locally, it is really much more around social stuff rather than campaigning, because Edge Fund is structured in such a way that we don't fall foul of Charity Commission rules around funding political groups and campaigning. We're not a charity. We particularly set ourselves up for that purpose. So someone like Westway Trust couldn't be suddenly funding all the, so again, thinking very clearly about what we want to fund. I think an important thing is that if it's going to be successful, it has to be real. I think that's really important. So that if we're going to run a pilot, we're going to get people involved, people are going to give their time, their energy, they're going to want to see this thing evolve, and then if at the end of it, none of that is taken into account, then people lose trust. So it's really about, making sure that happens. I think the strengths we kind of mentioned, the other thing is time commitment can be difficult, because the idea of participatory grant making is that the people who are applying for it, they're also involved in that process. It's not that you fill out the application and then you sit back and wait for a response. You come along and you participate in that decision-making process. You have to be prepared to give some time and energy, which is a different way, again, of doing things. I'm trying to think what other whatever weaknesses there are. Did we even come up? Did I come
What should
up?
you do? Would you like me to invite questions?
Yeah, I think that's probably the best thing, and I did have some notes here, which I can hardly see because I'm not wearing glasses, which I should really be doing.
Questions?
Yeah.
I'm sure they'll come to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. What questions or do people have?
Did you want to know about the process though that we're following? Did you want me to end with that?
Could do, if you want, yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful.
Yep.
So the process is that basically Anne is conducting some desk research where she's talking to funders and those particularly that have run these sorts of participatory grant funds to get their feedback, and we will be running some workshops, and we're doing it by ward in the 5 wards, which are this one, Goulburn, Colville, Delgano, and Nottingdale. So we'll be running a workshop in each ward, and then we'll follow that on with a more around issues based rather than locality. So the first thing is to establish in each ward across the different groups of people what priorities are, what do people want, what do we need, what do people want to do to change or improve their circumstances, what do they want to engage in, if it's arts or whatever else. And then the next step is then to refine that and to look at process. How would that work best? What model? Should we have our own model in North Kensington? Because we're quite unique in North Kensington. We're often the innovators and we're often the first to do it. So it might be that we take bits and elements from here, there, so really develop something that local people want and local people feel will work for them. I mean, that's in a nutshell what the process is.
Okay, good.
How can people in the street get involved, Isis? What's the best way for them to, if they want
So,
to participate?
I'm developing a blurb for a flyer that we're going to put out. It will go out through your comms team, through social media. Then we will, I'm sure, put information in local venues around here. Phil and I have gone through a list of all the local venues, ward by ward, the usual suspects, and so we will hold sessions, workshop sessions, which will be open space in the first instance, in these venues, so that each people in those wards, it makes it easy for them to attend. We will then sort of look at what people want, and then the next stage will be to hold a couple of other workshops where we will refine or feedback what people felt were priorities, what they wanted, and then look a little bit more process, and that will be done in a less, in a more collective way, because it'll go sort of from 5 down to I think 2 or 3 at the end.
Okay, thank you. Yep.
I think we're really keen to get as many residents as involved as possible, because I think traditionally the grant making has been for groups, and that doesn't mean to say that will stop, but I think if we can work with people,
because the residents are going to give information on the priorities.
There was 2 things I was thinking of. Every time these things go out, somebody's going to say, I never knew anything about it, and then you're going to get the complaint. So that bit is obviously going to be really important. So residents associations will hear about it. Some residents associations are very lively, some are moribund, so you have to just see.
So we're targeting the voluntary sector, residents associations.
And faith groups?
Sorry?
Faith groups?
Well, yeah.
Because we're going to get, the other thing I was thinking about, you get these people around, some of them will be groups and they're ready to deliver, they're deliverers, but others will be just residents who think, well, I wish this was going on in my ward. And do you have some role then of saying, here's a couple of good ideas, just from an individual, they don't want to do it, but they know what's needed, putting those resources and people together in a sense?
Well, what we're trying to do is to discern from the community what they want, to gather that information and to feed it back to Westway Trust to inform the development of a pilot. So whatever we hear, whatever people prioritise, whatever people are saying, that is what is going to be then delivered to Westway, and then it's up to Westway Trust to configure or implement, to incorporate that information into what will become the pilot. So it could be, we all, in Dalgano, we all want funding to do, I don't know, I can't think of something.
Model weather.
Yeah, and then here, and then in Colville we want to do lots of art stuff. So then we need to then work out, and then that's where Westway will come in and work out.
That's where the development aspect of it comes. It's not people not coming with fully formed ideas and how they're going to deliver it.
No.
There's a development aspect, which I think Westway has kind of lost over the years. So hopefully that's going to give.
Sort of links into the previous
Sorry, how do you stop individuals having
How do you stop them?
Yeah, I mean, have you had experience of that happening where a group will turn up with 5?
Yeah, that could actually, that's an interesting one. That's one I did mention. We have to look at dynamics, and sometimes there can be an imbalance, of course, if it's an individual and then it's quite a large, well-funded group. But then again, at Edge we have criteria about, for example, groups. If they're above a certain amount income, they're not eligible for the funds. So these are the sorts of things to take into consideration. So to look at power imbalances. And I think that would be really important, because of course we wouldn't want individuals to lose out or to feel they didn't have a voice. And again, that comes down to the facilitation process to make sure that everybody present, there's a thing that sometimes I use, that hear every voice and ensure that everybody has a voice, regardless of whether you're an individual resident, whose language is English is not their first language, or somebody who sits on the board of an organisation.
Yeah. Other questions? Responses, thoughts, ideas, triggered?
I'm going to look at some of the things you talked about. It's really interesting, quite tricky in some ways. What do you insist that there's some sort of a group bank account though for anything that you give? Because obviously you're not going to give the money into
Edge Fund.
Yeah, well, or for whatever you're going to do here at Westway. There has to be some sort of
that's part of the conversation.
Yeah, and also that's coming down to the structure of the organisation. Yeah, so with Edge Fund, we're not a charity. We can give money to individuals. We have a very flexible setup. And again, it might be that the Westway Trust need to think about, maybe having a particular structure specifically for that grant making purpose. That's separate. It will really depend. I don't know what your legal structure.
Or you hold money on behalf of people.
I don't know. I mean, I don't think actually writing the cheque is the issue. We can write the cheque. The important thing is the decision process about who is going to get the cheque.
Right.
What they're going to do with it.
And we've got one role, which is to make sure it's legal. But apart from that, it's honouring the decisions. And that's what you're saying. We've got to go into it, with full commitment.
Yeah.
So what about the cheque, providing it fits those criteria? So I don't really think that's, unless people think we ought to do it in a different way, because why not? But I think
we've given you, Ananias, quite an open brief, and so I guess that whatever they come up with, the best proposals that they might come up might have a resource issue. So they could potentially be the resource in terms of the actual money that goes out of the door, but then is how the actual fund is managed.
Yeah, and the time.
And the time that takes.
So is it more time intensive?
Well, it could be. What's the?
It depends how. It depends. I mean, for yourselves, you're in a very privileged position because you have quite a well-resourced organisation in terms of human resources. At Edge Fund we have 2 organisers. EDGE. Yeah.
Okay.
So
and how many projects? So 2 people for how many projects would you use that, or support? Or how many?
Well, we fund about every round we fund about 40 of them.
40.
Yeah, 40 to 50. But we have, the application process, we can have up to 300. I mean, it's gone down to 200 and something. I mean,
Can you give us a flavour of what happens on a day or over a period of time?
So the regional organisers, they spend their time sifting through and then sort of taking out, and then it's sent out to the membership to score. Again, the membership are involved in scoring, and we have community councils. We have it according to identity, so race and ethnicity, migrants and refugees, Gypsy, Roma and travelling communities. What did I say? LGBTQI, disability, and working class and impoverished, and women and I can't remember what it's called. Women, because it's like gender identity. And then we have systemic change and environmental change. So we have 7 or 8 community councils, and so applications are grouped according to what they're applying for. If it's an environmentalist group, it's put into that, and then the members who sit on those councils then sit through and do a kind of like a check, to make sure that it's. So
is there a way of declaring an interest, or if a community group applies and you're something judging?
Yes.
Yeah.
You have to. So I'm involved in a number of organisations, and sometimes the organisations I'm involved with will apply to Edge Fund, and I always declare an interest because I can't score it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's just, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, it's all the things that we'd expect in terms of integrity, transparency, accountability, but it's just how, the nuances of how we do it, so that it's really much more in the hands of the recipient than in the donor, should we say, or the grant giver.
How many chickpeas did you get through?
A lot. When we went to Barcelona, me and Rose, we had bags of chickpeas because we had to run this massive workshop. It's the Edge Funders Alliance, which is a big European, well, it was actually the American Edge Funders Alliance. It was, you know, hundreds of European funders and some international ones. And we ran this massive workshop with about 30 or 40 people. So, yeah, we each had a huge bag of chickpeas that we'd take with us.
Can you say something about how the grant making process can be used to refine the themes that we could grant make? And to put that in context, you could think of, if we define a theme and then we get lots of people to apply within that theme and they vote on that theme, it could entrench particular themes. And what we want is, of course, a process that makes the themes more and more relevant to the local area outside perhaps the people who are applying for those grants.
I suppose ultimately it's going to be testing what you think you know, and what you think your residents or the local people want versus what they think they want. So it'll be interesting. So for example, you've just had this piece of work done with a hatch. I'm allowed to say it. Okay, so the hatch report has actually come out and produced a set of findings which is saying, you know, these are the things that local people are saying they want. It's obviously being conducted in the same sort of way of workshopping and speaking to people. In fact, when I was at the board meeting, everything I heard in your report actually was stuff that I would say, yeah, exactly, as a local resident. So, you know, it's very much coming from the mouths of the people locally. Now, that's your starting point. But of course, like you said, we could run these workshops and then we hear something completely different from people who like Cynthia pointed out, maybe were missed out and didn't get interviewed by Hatch. And so, you know, we need to be, again, flexible. And then we need to look at, you know, somebody saying, you know, coffee mornings and somebody saying isolation or empowerment. You know, how does that fit? Is it that really what they're looking at is
how do we get the best learning?
And I think you've had a really good piece of work done. We've got some information there on the ground, and now it's about kind of, again, you know, because when you say to people, yeah, this is about funding and giving money for doing things, hopefully that's a bit of a carrot. And that can be one of the positive things about participatory grant making. It is actually about giving money. And as we know, everybody's strapped for cash, and all of us who do community stuff and always, whatever it is, always needs money. So hopefully we're going to get quite a few people who will be interested and actually will feed in. They'll be interested to match that with Hatch, and I'm sure we'll find a lot of that, you know, crossing over basically. But we don't know for sure. This is the thing. It is it's a little bit of a risk.
Yeah.
Right, so I've just got a few questions. First of all, I'm really happy to come on board with this, and you've decided that this is what Westway should be focusing on, and hopefully Westway will embrace it. I wanted to ask, is the process still going to be like a written application, or are you saying it's totally going to be an oral presentation, or is it both?
Right, well that again comes down to the people. So at Edge Fund we started, so we do a review after every round, but then, you know, we're like activists and stuff, so we have to be really careful that we are what we say we are. With the Edge Fund, we started off with a longer application, and it's now down to 2 A4 sides. It's really simple. And in situations where people would find it difficult to write that, we will offer to have one of our organisers or one of our members of our facilitation group, or another member who volunteers, to actually do oral interviews with people. It's kind of like a Viva, I suppose. You know, so like somebody who might have dyslexia, who might not want to write it down, they could be interviewed. And they could do it. You can send in a video, as long as you address the criteria, because we have, you know, 4, 5 criteria. Still, whatever it is, I mean, I think one of the, you know, I wouldn't call it a con, but one of the realities, because that's the thing about being real as well, one of the realities is you cannot give money to people without criteria. You can't just say, hey, take it. It just doesn't work in this world, unless, you know, it's your own money and you just want to do that. But as an organisation, there has to be some accountability. So even if it's, you know, you've got 3 criteria, the people at least have got to be able to show that they demonstrate they fit those criteria. So yeah, we do have criteria, but we make it easy.
Okay. And another question. So is a part of participatory grant making, does that also include the community saying, you know, well actually we need this amount for this sort of a project or that amount? So does it include the community making a decision of how much they would actually need for certain? Because right now obviously Westway will say, you know, what is it, like 4Ks for a festival fund, 2.5 for the small community grant. So would the participatory grant making sort of allow the community to say, well actually we would need that amount for this sort of a project and that amount for this sort of a project, so making a decision on how much they would actually need. And also the sort of grants, so earlier before you came I was mentioning that something like a financial grant that supports new CICs and startups for like core running costs and things like that is really needed. And I think it was being given out a long time ago through Westway Trust, because I've actually read it off your website. So is that something that the participatory grant making sort of research will think about and sort of propose as well? Do you know what I mean? Like the sort of
whatever
grants
the
and
people,
amounts
whatever
of
people
money.
ask for. So, you know, it's about the issues they want to deal with, but it's also about how it works.
Yeah.
So it's, if people say, but again, we have to be realistic. If people are saying we want 100, we think 150k should be the average grant. I think that would be.
You can ask it.
Yeah, exactly. I think we need to have tangible things. But I agree. I mean, it might be that people are saying I'd rather have larger grants and fewer of them than smaller grants and many of them. So these are the things we have to balance.
Because right now they're project based because of the amount that you offer. I mean, realistically, you can't go running longer than a month or 2 or 3 maximum. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Is it not though? Because I was envisaging that we'd get to a situation, and maybe I'm 5 steps ahead, but that we'd get to a situation where we either sort of look at, there's a sort of a geographical area, and we say, Westway says, you know, there's £50,000 for this geographical area, and here's the insight that we've got from Hatch and everyone else, and there's a group of people who want to participate in this, who've got ideas, and it's for that group to determine how that £50,000 is spent. And so you pitch your idea and it's 10,000, and Cynthia says, oh, mine's 5, and then you have that conversation between you about actually how do we make this money go as far as it can to deliver all of these good things, and the group that's there decide. And we don't, as Westway, we just say, here's the money, and we'll facilitate and enable and support. And I suppose that's what I was thinking of how it would work. So we wouldn't get to this, oh, it's got to be this amount or that amount, you know, the group decides, essentially.
Well, unless in the process, the general feedback is, you know, grants should be in the area of, you know, £7,000 or example. If that's something that we hear from everyone, then we have to take it on board. But then equally, you know, it's really up in the air.
Yeah, I think we should try and be open about all of that actually.
Just in the mechanics of how it works, is there potential for like a rolling program rather than like deadlines? Just because lots of projects happen and come about at different times of the year, and a lot of the projects don't fit in with the time frames that we have.
Again, that's open, and the implication for that is staff time.
Yeah.
Because clearly, when a fund has a beginning and an end, so you know, a 3-month process, then staff are allocated to do particular pieces of work with a timeline, and it's very clear. If it's a rolling process, then you'd have to have somebody dedicated. And you know, the way of working, structuring the work of the staff would be different. That's really the implications there.
More questions?
Yeah, can I kind of put this back to Westway and ask, are there any governance issues that may restrict the way this works?
No,
It's an easy answer.
We have charitable objectives that we can only work in certain areas. Actually, they're quite wide. I mean, one of the criticisms is that we've widened our charitable purposes, so we can do far more these days. I mean, there are specific things that aren't in our objectives. religion is one, animals is another. So, within our constitution, we couldn't do that, but fairly broadly based, so we hopefully would be able to respond. But the other thing is, if the community are saying, actually, this is what needs to be funded because this is important and you're not empowered to do it, that is a wake-up call for us to actually look at what powers we have, because we can always go to the charity. I mean, we do have a catch-all. Any other purpose, that's charity. But, given we've excluded certain things specifically, I think that would be a problem if, someone said, okay, we want you to fund the cats home. That would be a real problem. But I think pretty widely. But as long as it's, not private benefit. So that's the other thing in charity law. You can't say, I'm going to set up, and this is one of the things about startups, is we're going to set up an enterprise, and can you give us money to do that? Well, that's for you yourself, unless you can demonstrate it's a community organisation, community interest company. That's problematic. So I think, as Isa says, the most important thing is to write out what are the parameters that we can fund and make that clear at the beginning. Because we wouldn't want to put those barriers in place, but there are some.
Okay.
I was just going back to what you were talking about, you painted a picture of, you apply for a grant, you think you need more than what's on offer or whatever. Yeah. Going back to the chickpea table thing, so if you've got everybody around the table, and Emmanuel presents her idea, and I present my idea, and Jenny presents her idea, and there are links, there are things that we, instead of maybe 10 and 5, could you say, if you work together, you could do it to 12? I mean, is there an option to work like that, to actually get people to work together where they've got, they're driving in a particular direction?
There is, but we don't direct people to. So,
no,
for example,
but to just...
because we're so flexible, if exactly that if that happened, that would be fine. In fact, the Radical Sharing Forum, which was our way of evaluating projects, was very much about bringing people together also to see if we could encourage collaboration. So the point that Mark was just making about individuals and stuff, we are very careful. We don't give much funding to individuals because we'd rather fund groups because we don't want it to be for individuals. So we've had people apply because they want to run training. But the reality is they're paying themselves to run the training. So even though the training might be really brilliant about, making sure that women's voices are heard, or something around discrimination or racialization or something, if it's not going to, if they're going to be paying themselves, and we wouldn't really fund that. We'd rather fund, and we'd rather say to them, can't you join up with an organisation or work with an organisation? They can apply, and then they're paying you. But it's really about that, trying to get that public benefit.
Just a really quick question, just because we're on the topic of grant making, and I've realised not just Westway Trust, but it's an issue with the Arts Department and other sort of grant providers, repeat projects. Right, so say you put on a project and the children are loving it, or the young people are loving it, and they don't want it to end in 2 months or 3 months. But the grant providers are saying, we don't want repeat projects. I mean, what is the way out of that, really? Because you want it to run, you want it to continue running. So, for example, a long time ago, we had so many youth centres in the area, and the youth provision and the funding for that, that's all gone. So, when you had the youth provisions like youth arts and all the rest, you had these courses and these projects running for the whole year. Now you don't have that. But grant providers, you have this clause that says, anything that's been done before can't be applied for again. So,
because the organisation just learn to game it and make it look like it's something new.
Well, that's really the point thing. It really is.
The way we're dealing with that in the Edge Fund is we do repeat funding, but also one of the things that for our, obviously it's an activist community, that we are doing is that we are developing a model whereby we support and work with groups that we funded to help them grow to reach the next stage. So we've African Rainbow Family, we funded them a few times, but then we would do work with them. We also support and we make links. So for example, linking a local group here with the Tudor Trust, and being able to say, look, we funded this group, £3,000 or £5,000. They delivered this. We were really impressed by it. Actually, can we we're almost acting as not a guarantor, but what do you call it, a referee almost. And then, you know, so when a group that maybe would not ordinarily have the kind of gravitas to go to a bigger funder, but with the support of a funding organisation and behind it that has more of a chance. So now, instead of them just applying for the 5,000, they're applying maybe for 15 or 20,000, and we might provide support for them in that process. To capacity build. So it's not only about giving money, it's also about thinking how the organisation can capacity build smaller organisations to take them to the next stage, help them to develop membership models whereby, you know, if they've got 100 members paying £10 a year, they're bringing in X amount towards their call cost. So there's different ways of doing it.
Isis, thank you very much indeed for that.
Just how Westway would embrace what I was saying, because that's obviously the edge fund, but with regards to
Well, I think, I mean, this is not, I suppose for us, it's like
partnering
we're kind of
with
looking at all of the kind of different grant making that we provide. But I mean, you're right. I mean, with the
Because there's always
community
that
grants,
clause about repeat projects, right? So
yeah, I suppose for us it's about trying to make the money go round as much as possible to as many groups as it is. Because, you know, I mean, you're right. The funds are pretty limited, and so it's difficult to be able to justify the kind of idea of repeat funding, because then it precludes other organisations
That's
to come
what
in.
Isis described was the development approach, is how you...
But
it's resources.
So again, coming back to human resources, and also Westway may perhaps, again, becoming more involved in working with other funders, networking and finding ways to support that.
I'm going to draw us to a close because the time is against us. Can I just, before you all shift out, can I say thank you very much indeed to our two talkers. Very, very useful. Thank you to all of you for showing up on what turned out to be a rainy evening, you may have just stated. Is there anything else that anyone wants to say? Any final words? We all good?
I would love to thank the group. I think it's been really, really helpful, you know, and the respectful and the creativity. I think it's been fantastic.
Great. Thank you.